Why do we no longer get along? Let me ask you this. How many of you have lost a friend or fallen out with a family member over Brexit? Give me a hand sign, please. A few in the back here, a few. How many of you have had debates over vaccines? Wow, okay. What about feminism? Transgender rights, anyone? Climate change? Wow. Studies show that most of us have had heated arguments with friends or family over at least one of these topics. A 2021 survey found that at least 1 in 12 Britons have stopped speaking to a friend because of a Brexit-related argument. A quarter have had emotional debates with family. 5% had threats of physical violence from strangers. Brexit was one example of a binary, black and white debate that was tied to identity conflicts between two opposed groups. You didn't vote to leave or stay in the EU. You were a leaver or a remainer. The same was true for the last US election. You voted either for or against racial justice, gender equality, and environmental protection. It seemed as though there was no in-between, really. We are entering a decade of hyperpolarization. 2 years in, the 2020s have already been marked by rapidly widening divisions along the frontiers of race, gender, sexuality, science, and the environment. Now, the first question we should ask is, does it matter? I mean, people have been hyperpolarized over sillier questions, such as whether pineapple belongs on pizza, whether or not to use the Oxford comma. But the type of polarization we're seeing today is a lot less superficial than pineapple on pizza, and the stakes are quite a bit higher than for Oxford commas. The questions that divide us today as a society touch on deep identity issues. They have even begun to pose a real threat to our democratic institutions, our fundamental values, and our social tissue. And they have started to escalate in group-based violence and targeted hate campaigns. I am a science-loving, anti-racist feminist. But for my research, I have met with racists, anti-feminists, climate change deniers, and conspiracy theorists. I used undercover identities to be recruited into the networks of white supremacists, to join the women-hating incel community, and to interview some pretty crazy members of the QAnon conspiracy theory movement. I wanted to see what the most radical fringes look like, because I believe that we can no longer ignore the rapid rise of polarization. In spring 2021, I played an association game with one of the UK's most prominent white supremacists, Mark Collett. To Mark, I was Claire, a free speech warrior and patriot. Mark Collett is the founder of the Patriotic Alternative, a British movement that has reached out to the country's youngest generations by hosting video gaming tournaments and by releasing alternative homeschooling curricula in the midst of the lockdowns. Whatever keyword I gave Mark, from Black Lives Matter, feminism, Joe Biden, to COVID deniers, to COVID and the climate crisis, he somehow managed to tie it all back to the so-called white genocide. This conspiracy idea that assumes that whites are gradually being replaced by non-whites is at the heart of his movement. So he adapted every single topic to fit this identity. Climate change, he would argue, is merely a construct invented by the global elites to guilt-trip white people. A few months later, I found myself entering the gates of Hyde Park to attend the Unite for Freedom anti-vaxxer rally. I was surrounded by signs such as, "Stop the pedo elites," and "Shut down the BBC," or "Smash the New World Order." Sorry, it was really ridiculous. But unlike in previous undercover trips, I didn't really have to worry about my appearance at all. because the crowd was as eclectic as it gets. I stood in between a woman in dreadlocks and baggy pants, an ordinary-looking old man in a wheelchair, a man with fascist tattoos and a shaved head, and an elegantly dressed woman in a retro dress and a Kentucky Derby hat. This protest had attracted people ranging from hardline conspiracy theorists and neo-Nazi skinheads, all the way to alternative medicine esoterics, Christian fundamentalists, and just worried parents. They had all found a lowest common denominator: their victimhood identity. They all believed that they were victims of a global conspiracy that they called the plandemic. Now, some of you might say, most people aren't as extreme as Mark Collette or COVID deniers. True, but their cases show us that today's polarization is all about identity. Indeed, a 2021 survey found that the UK and other Western countries are divided more by identity than by issues. 88% of Labour supporters said they dislike Tory politicians, and 74% of Tory supporters said they disliked Labour politicians. In the US, this left-right hostility was even more pronounced. 90% of Biden supporters said they disliked Republicans, and 93% of Trump voters said the same about Democrats. Political partisanship also went hand in hand with how likely these people were to self-identify as feminists or anti-racists. But then, when you actually ask these people specific questions about gender equality or racial justice, they more often than not aligned on these topics. So in other words, political polarization is in many cases completely unnecessary. A year ago, the dating app OkCupid asked 5 million of its users worldwide if they could imagine to date someone who holds strong political opinions that are opposite of theirs. An impressive 60% said, no way. Political polarization has not just decreased the odds of cross-ideological friendships or romance, it has also led to outward hostility between the opposed groups of the culture wars. Experts call this effective polarization, which creates a strong us versus them mentality and can even lead to aggressive behavior towards the outgroup. Across the world, climate change deniers have launched disinformation campaigns against environmental movements. Conspiracy theorists have staged attacks on scientific institutions. They stormed the US Capitol and the German Reichstag. Black Lives Matter protests have been met with racist violence from the so-called White Lives Matter movement. Feminists have clashed with anti-feminists, transgender rights activists with anti-LGBTQ campaigners. Last year, a sympathizer of the violent misogynist incel movement shot dead 5 people in Plymouth, while France has seen a dramatic surge in the number of lethal attacks on the transgender community. And in Germany, many of you will have heard of this case, a COVID denier linked to QAnon killed the cashier in a petrol station after they had a fight over a face mask. I mean, can we expect polarization to get any worse at this point? Or have we reached something like peak polarization yet? What can we do to prevent that these various polarization frontiers escalate in violent conflict, terrorism, and even war? Polarization and even radicalization in times of crisis are deeply human. Just looking back at history, we can see that previous health crises such as the plague or cholera, but also previous economic crises like the Great Depression of 1929 or even the 2008 financial crisis, and security crises like 9/11, also caused major spikes in polarization, anti-minority hatred, and the spread of conspiracy myths. So now we're seeing a combined health and socioeconomic crisis. And we're witnessing unprecedented levels of loneliness, economic hardship, uncertainty, and declining mental health. Now add the effects of social media to this. online forums have turned into international battlegrounds for diametrically opposed groups. In the past, both technological innovation and existential threats have led to major upheavals in the world's power structures. The combination of coronavirus and rapidly changing modes of social interaction will most certainly bring a seismic shift in our identities, as individuals, as groups, and as a society. Powerful identity dynamics are the main thread that runs through hyperpolarized communities. Radical movements manage to create a strong sense of exclusivity, and exclusivity can evoke a feeling of belonging. Many of the radical members of extremist groups that I observed actually completely gave up on their individual identity to fully embrace the group identity. In social psychology, this phenomenon is called identity fusion. For my DPhil in anthropology here at Oxford University, I'm studying this concept of identity fusion. And previous research done by the Oxford Center for the Study of Social Cohesion actually showed that it's often shared negative experiences among group members that leads individual identities to fuse with the group identity. For example, this phenomenon can be observed among war veterans, football fans, and even members of college fraternities, when they go through intense shared experiences like war trauma, humiliating defeats in football, or tough initiation procedures. And the same can be seen in radical ideological groups, especially when they get into fights with counter-protesters or when they experience perceived censorship on social media. Now, this phenomenon, or this effect of identity fusion, makes individuals more likely to commit acts of violence and terrorism on behalf of the group. I'm convinced that we need to pay attention to all activists, no matter how radical or counterfactual their causes. Of course, the arguments of climate change deniers, anti-vaxxers, and white supremacists are deeply flawed, and usually based on misinformation and conspiracy myths. Believe me, it was everything but easy to calmly listen to someone telling me that everyone in Buckingham Palace is a reptile drinking the blood of innocent children to stay young. I felt equally revolted when listening to the rants of white supremacists or incels. One incel told me that he wanted to rape and murder all women who didn't give him sex to take revenge on them. But all of these individuals have emotional stories that are worth listening to. The same incel who vowed for violence against women was also a profoundly hurt and vulnerable individual who was ultimately looking for more love, security, and belonging in his life. There are many ways to tackle the rapid rise of polarization and the erosion of the political middle. Policymakers should ask, who is most vulnerable to be groomed by extremist groups, especially in light of the ongoing mental health and socioeconomic crisis that we're witnessing? Tech firms should ask, how can we prevent that our algorithms amplify the most radical voices out there? And how can we give a better platform to those who stand up for some form of middle ground or consensus narrative? And all of us should ask ourselves, when was the last time I had a drink with my friend who voted differently in the Brexit referendum? Thank you.